History is a really interesting thing, mostly down to the fact that lots of people, when they look at history, read it for what it is. It's a bit like the media. You're not meant to read everything you hear, and you're meant to question things when you see them. And historically, dependent on who's writing the history, whether it be a Marxist, a revisionist, a post-revisionist, or perhaps even somebody from a certain political standpoint, or from a different country, history can change quite dramatically. And today we're looking at an example of exactly that, and this is to do with generals, specifically in the British Army of World War I and their involvement within the war. Now, there is a phrase in Britain called the lions led by donkeys, and this refers to British generals in World War I, down to the fact that many regard them as cowardice and pretty much useless in the World War I historical picture of things. Now yeah, I am slightly exaggerating here, but there seems to be an overall popularist culture that seems to say, well, generals in World War I, well, they were just cowards. And some of that isn't actually the case. Now, where has this come from and what exactly is going on? Today, we're looking at exactly that. So, like I mentioned, popular culture. The idea at the moment of generals in World War I history is that they were this sort of upper class, uncaring, and failed leadership core of the British Army. Now, it's just sort of this stemmed idea that has come out of some of the historical figures that we've seen from World War I. Now, in World War I, very few generals died. Out of the 1,000 or so that there were, it's estimated that in the region of 30 to 40 were actually killed in combat, and this has led to the whole sort of conception of them being cowardice. Now, in World War I, if you were a general, you were actually not allowed to go over the top. Lots of people sort of see these images of some guy jumping up over the trench and telling everybody to go forward, and they go, yeah, that's the guy in charge. But in actuality, that was probably just a soldier of a lower rank who simply had to do his job. Now, as a general, if you went up over the trench, you would be pretty much disciplined by the military corps, because that's just something you're not allowed to do. You're supposed to be the front line of intelligence as opposed to the front line of battling. But where exactly does this myth come from that generals are sort of incompetent and failures and inaccurate and just weren't that much useful for World War I? And it comes from a few stories that have happened in World War I, but I'm going to mention one specifically today called the Battle of Aubers Ridge, and this pretty much defines and will give you a good picture of why generals in World War I, especially in the British Army, were seen as these incompetent people who for some reason were dressed up as heroes and thrown into war. So in less than a year of combat in World War I, Germany started shifting troops from the Western Front to fight against Russia in the Eastern Front, and Britain and France thought they could take advantage of this weakened army and start launching an attack. The British created an attack on Aubers Ridge, and this was an absolute failure. Commanders ordered a short military bombardment of artillery, and this approach had worked at a few other battles in the previous months before this, but it was against significantly defended German forces, and it didn't go how they intended. The attack failed to achieve any of its objectives. It didn't capture any trenches, it didn't make any ground, and it didn't destroy the German foothold in the region. 11,000 soldiers were killed or wounded, and hardly any of them actually made it out of the trenches, which was the overall scale of failure. Under the command of Field Marshal Sir John French and General Sir Douglas Haig, it was something that gave the British Army a major rethink of how it made its battles work and how it conducted them, and it was a mistake that the army said should never repeat again. Now, this is pretty much the biggest stereotype of incompetent British leadership, but it isn't exactly the full picture. Now, although this battle was an absolute failure and was a complete disaster, the generals were working off of standing orders and things that they were meant to follow. The idea of something that was working and did not want to change. Now, in World War I, warfare was a brand new dawn. It was something that was new and different. There were new weaponry on the field, there was new artillery, things had changed. So when these artillery bombardments worked in places like Chapelle 2 months earlier than this actual offensive, the idea was, don't fix what ain't broke. And that's pretty much what the generals went for. It was a complete failure, a tactical failure, and just a failure in general as to losing so many men in such a battle that accomplished nothing. But it made the army rethink its strategy. But battles like this pretty much defined all of World War I. For soldiers that were in the trenches and people who have made history from this and people who have discussed World War I since then, generals have had this sort of Battle of Orba's Ridge plastered all over them, as opposed to a general who perhaps was conducting warfare at a very good level and tactically was very keen. Sir Douglas Haig is an interesting character, and he's had a lot of accusations against him as a sort of standout poster boy for what generals were in World War I. So the first accusation that really has been made against him is that he didn't understand his soldiers, and in actuality this is very wrong. Apparently Haig was well renowned for actually mixing in with his soldiers and trying to understand them as best as he could. He was very aware of the fact that he was working with recruits and troops that simply just weren't up for the task, and documented history will conflict on this. Many will say, well, actually he was a fantastic general who understood his troops. Others would say, actually he didn't, and he was just a simply incompetent aristocrat who had thrown innocent men into battle. But it just depends on the standpoint that you see. There's also another accusation that he never actually won a major offensive, but this just simply isn't factually true. Haig actually led his armies to decisive victories in the 100 Days Offensive that ended German capitulation on 11th of November, and it's not the only battle that he's also had context in too. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 saw heavy loss of life but was a success for the Allies, and he argued that it created the conditions for victory in 1918 by weakening German morale. And Haig is just generally one of these people that has been thrown out there as somebody who was an absolute failure, but in actuality was a general who did have success. Although he did have his failures and did fail a battle, everybody seems to sort of have this general picture in history that war was very clear cut, and there were very clear lines as to what you could do right and what you could do wrong. Most of the generals, most of the soldiers, and pretty much most of the army had not experienced proper warfare like this at this scale before. So everybody sort of just jumped in and said, well, they did this wrong, they did this wrong, they did this wrong. But really it was a steep learning curve for everybody. So, were generals bad? Yes, arguably. There are 1,100 or so of them, and in the grand scheme of things, they were simply inexperienced, and many of them were as inexperienced as the soldiers they were sending into battle. Were they effective on the battlefield? Yes, they were, especially in terms of strategy, and especially in terms of collaboration and working together as a focused military unit. So, in the end, although generals had their failures in World War I, they were actually a benefit to World War I. They did have their failures. They do have, for example, things that we saw, certain battles and certain stories that perhaps will scar their reputation. But in actuality, although the aristocratic upper class did never actually see a lot of battle or simply hid in the trenches, they were pinnacle to winning some of the battles that took place. So that's about it for today's history and tales from the battlefield as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and a bit of a backdrop on generals. As always, like I say, make sure you do some fact checking. I mentioned earlier in the video that perhaps there were roughly 40 deaths. I believe that may actually be in the region of 80 or 70, and I roughly miscalculated because I've been doing lots of sort of general fact checking and going over. Make sure you do your own reading as well, because it's an interesting period. I also recommend the Great War channel on YouTube. He's fantastic. As always, guys, it's been me, the Tactical Brit. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you again soon in another video.